Okay, thank you very much. My name is Wendy Pullen, and I am delighted to be here this afternoon. It's afternoon in Cambridge, and good morning or good evening to you, wherever you may happen to be. I'm going to be talking about questions to do with conflict, reconstruction, and heritage in a presentation that I've entitled Urban Collisions. Now, I'd like to begin by saying we are witnessing a situation today where there is more destruction of cities because of war and conflict than there has been since World War II. So we are in a potentially very, very dangerous sort of situation. I am going to argue in this talk that the conditions of heritage and reconstruction, what's often called conservation, are changing radically, and that we have to change our attitudes towards this. That the idea that you have war damage and then you immediately go into a reconstruction period is probably over in many, many places. And that even with the best will in the world, with the expertise of architects and conservationists and legal experts and engineers and so on, that linear process from damage to reconstruction is no longer a simple one. And so if we take my first slide here, we're looking at two very ordinary, seemingly straightforward apartment buildings in Mostar in the former Yugoslavia. Now, one has clearly been restored, and the other one not at all. And really the question of why one has been restored and the other not is complicated. I'm using this slide symbolically as much as anything else. What I'm really interested in is the seam in between these two buildings. Because symbolically I can say that this is where the complexity of the process of reconstruction and thinking about heritage can be seen to happen. Now, that may not sound very promising to you, that the lecture is going to be based on a seam between two buildings, but let me get on with it, and hopefully I'll be able to find things that will interest you that do relate to that seam. Now, I think I'd like to start actually with damage that was caused by an earthquake, not by war damage. But we are looking at the questions of heritage and reconstruction that, at least theoretically, apply to natural disasters as well. Now, the Lisbon earthquake in 1755 devastated the city of Lisbon, and the Marquês de Pombal was tasked with reconstructing the city. He took the attitude that we bury the dead and we heal the living. So very much the attitude that he was just going to get on with things. What he chose in the end was really the most radical and rational and modernistic plan possible, which is the slide that you see on the right-hand side. And with it, the beginning of seismology. He was informed by the beginning of a scientific understanding of earthquakes, and very, very much the idea that humans could be in control of destruction. And we have this example here being seen as the pivot point, at least symbolically, moving between a pre-modern society and the beginning of a modern society. And really, from Voltaire to Adorno, we have a lot of writing about this as being the key point in European history that can be seen as the beginning of modernity. Now, I think what we're looking at here is something that has dominated our thinking ever since. And that there is this conscious building of culture from chaos to order. From the chaos of the earthquake, we get to the order of this very, very rational plan. And I would say that this sort of direction from chaos to order has been the basis of reconstruction and heritage thinking and practice ever since. All right, now let's fast forward and let's look at a city that's probably familiar to many of you at this point, and that's Aleppo in Syria. My slide here shows Aleppo in 2011, so this is just before the beginning of the civil war in Syria. It was a World Heritage Site. In 2006, they completed a major reconstruction program because it was becoming the Islamic capital of culture for the year 2006. Now, by 2015, Aleppo looks like this, and it's many, many historic monuments. I mean, Aleppo was an exceedingly important medieval city, and all of that is in fragments. Aleppo was one of the most destroyed and badly damaged cities in the Civil War. And with it, it raises many, many questions. The first one is why intentionally destroy your own city? Because much of the war damage was caused by government regime forces. It makes us ask, I think, well, what are the chances for Aleppo in the future? We have with it a tremendous amount of demographic change, demographic antipathy, and how do you build a city where there is so much dissent? I mean, certainly just a picture like that, but the history that we know of Aleppo, its recent history, really makes a transformation in terms of how we view conflict and cities and reconstruction. And I would say that the reconstruction of Aleppo is subject to the nature of the conflict, much more than the nature of reconstruction policy as it is right now. That we see a break from the rational tradition that we saw in Lisbon after the earthquake, and instead of going from chaos to order, we seem to be going really from order to chaos if we look at the recent history of Aleppo. Now, I think I would like to make 2 points about why this might be happening. I think that, first of all, it's important to see that conflicts have probably changed, that the conflicts that we know, say, from World War II, where there would be a declaration of war, wars would be fought, there would be destruction, there'd be peace negotiations and some sort of treaty or an end to the conflict, and then after that, there would be a period of post-conflict or renewal. I mean, that is pretty much what we're used to at this point. But what we're looking at now really is an era of what Mary Kaldor has called new wars. And that these new wars, according to Kaldor, are fought primarily in the name of identity politics rather than ideological or geopolitical interests. That wars of these sorts are increasingly directed against civilians, and that there is a process of trying to control certain civilian groups and very often to displace them. The conflicts of this sort tend to be long-term, and I would say that actually they are even indeterminate, because we get periods of extreme violence, and they may be interspersed with periods of relative peacefulness. And we tend to get these cycles of violence and peacefulness. And so that makes us wonder, is there really such a thing as post-conflict? I mean, that becomes a very questionable sort of concept. And I would say, or I would go so far to say, that actually peace and conflict may be more simultaneous than we think. Now, the other point that's important to make here is that cities, I think, are the new arena of war. Increasingly, we're finding conflicts that are being fought out or somehow waged inside of cities. The city may be the target for attack, but In many cases, we find the conflicts are generated from within the city itself by different warring factions. The outcomes are very often unexpected, and these sorts of conflicts can escalate into full-scale wars, often very quickly, and sometimes very, very surprisingly. And this means that the conflicts in the cities can be quite long-term or very long-term, and that they will change the cities. So that if we look at the top slide here, this is Nicosia, which has been subject to conflict and a UN presence, and of course it's been divided since 1974. But in addition to cities being the locus of conflict, I would say that cities are also being used in order to wage war and to prolong conflicts. That the new wars really feed on the urban condition, and that urban infrastructures are often used in order to further different parties' interests in their conflicts, and sometimes ad hoc spaces and objects feature in the urban battles. And certainly in Hong Kong, we have a photograph of that on the lower part of the slide. We saw that the students particularly were using the city spaces in order to fight their battles. At the same time, we also see the urban demographics that are featuring in patterns of destruction, and I'll talk more about that, but that it even becomes patterns of ethnic cleansing and ultimately becomes part of the plans for reconstruction. So that the cities are very instrumental. They have there's a sense of agency as well as simply location. Now, for the second half of my lecture, having given you that very brief background, what I want to do is very, very quickly, because I don't have a huge amount of time, but very quickly I want to go through 8 main points that I think are key drivers in how we might be thinking about heritage and reconstruction today. And if we're not already thinking about these things, that it may give us some idea of how we might be thinking about these things. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think that these are 8 important points that are driving conflicts and reconstruction today. Now, the first one has to do with discourse and image. And in a way, this is quite obvious that the media matters. How we look at things, how the stories are told to us, the images that we see are very, very important in terms of how we understand the conflicts. But at the same time, and I would quote Andrew Herscher here, who says, material destruction is cultural production. So that the destruction itself actually becomes part of the process that forms the new order after that. We see in a city like Jerusalem, very, very important city historically and for religious reasons, but many people know Jerusalem today because of its separation barrier rather than its holy sites. And that gives some indication of how this idea of destruction is being turned into cultural production. One of my most memorable interviews that I've done was in Berlin with an East Berliner. And she said to me, in the period just after the demolition of the wall, when it was being removed completely, and there was no trace even of the path of the wall in the city, and she said, you know, it may be a bad history, but it's our history, and we really don't want to forget about it. You know, that sense that the conflicts matter as well as the more peaceful aspects of society. And so that here conflict becomes a new form of heritage, and new sites and artifacts are formed. And we have to look at the relationship between culture and violence and wonder, you know, are they always opposed to each other, or in some ways are they actually more complementary. Now, my second point has to do with heritage politics. And I think the first thing, that perhaps most obvious and most important, is that heritage meaning and practices are never, ever neutral. That heritage is used politically. It's very, very much part of the cultural production that Andrew Herscher talks about. He goes on to say that the nationalist impulse is deeply connected to the desire to reclaim the past, and to reclaim the past is also to invent it. And so I've put together 3 points here that I think are relevant. As we reconstruct our past, how are we going to understand it, and what are we doing to these sites? The first one is simply the destruction of sites, and with that we know, of course, there is the destruction of memory. The second one is that the destruction of sites also includes the destruction of the environment. And with that, the destruction of everyday life. And so in this is a Palestinian cartoon about their worries of the Israelis digging underneath the Dome of the Rock. So we see this in very, very bold terms, that the destruction of the environment has or can have a tremendous amount of impact. But the third point is that the invention of sites and creates a new everyday life, and that we are making heritage. We are not simply trying to conserve it. And all of these points affect how cities may or may not recover from extreme destruction. Now, the next point has to do with the questions of memory and ultimately identity politics, because I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is that the narratives of memory are becoming narratives of rights, and that conflict rather than memory is becoming increasingly common. And of course, what we've been seeing in the past couple of years is that monuments and memorials are particularly subject to this sort of action, and they are real focal points for ethnic and national struggle. I mean, in my slides here, what I'm illustrating is the dismantling of some of the statues in the southern states of the US. The statues of Confederate heroes that were being taken down. And I think the graph on the bottom left is a rather interesting one, because if we look at the far left side of it, that's the Civil War period, and we find there were actually very, very few statues put up for many decades after the Civil War. But the spike is in the Jim Crow area. So when society was moving towards a more segregationist sort of situation, decades after the war, this is when most of these statues were erected in many of the states in America. So what we're seeing with this is, though, is that when you knock them down, of course, is what you're getting is single cultural identities are being replacing what was often very diverse public spaces, and that's something that we need to be thinking about very, very carefully today. And despite any of the wrongs that were caused by the people who are being depicted in these statues. And I would say that this also tells us that ethnic cleansing has to do with place as well as with people, that the places actually matter very much, and how we articulate them through memorials becomes something that can be very, very pointed in our understandings. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, all right, what should we focus on? How do we know if we're right? I can't answer that in a half-an-hour lecture. I don't think I can answer it at all about being right. I'm not sure that we can ever say we're absolutely right. But I think what's important is that we do enough of the study, and we do enough homework in order to understand at least superficially we're getting things right. And I take as my example here the city of Mostar once again, and I think probably a number of you will recognize the bridge in the top photograph, which was blown up in the Yugoslavian Civil War. It's a Renaissance bridge, and it was rebuilt by the international community because it was considered to be so very, very important as something that brought the two sides of the city together over the river. However, if we actually map the city of Mostar, which some of my researchers did here, what we find, and you'll have to look very carefully at this map, the river is actually not the divider in the city. The Bosniak population lives on either side and lived on either side of that river. And if you look carefully, I hope you can see that there is a dotted line just to the left of the river, and it's labeled Boulevard. Now, Boulevard is the street that actually did divide the city. So to the west of that, you have the Croat population. To the east of that, you have the Bosniak population. And in my lower photograph here, what we have is a picture of that street, which has never been reconstructed, which is a very uncomfortable, difficult place, certainly not a meeting ground between the two sides of the city. So, and that's one example, I think, of the difficulties of how we focus and where we focus. Now, the demography of cities, then, is very, very important. And what we're finding as we do more and more research is that there is a correspondence between the bombing of civilians and the areas of the urban poor. What we think is happening in some cases is that there is intentional destruction of areas, demographic areas, where people disagree with the forces who are doing the bombing. And so that this can create a lot of displacement of different demographic groups and will have implications for ethnic and religious and racial divisions. Now, on the map on this slide, this is Homs in Syria. And on the left side of the map, what we see, and this is coming from UN material. What we see on the left side are areas of damage in the city. And the black area is the worst damage in the city. On the right-hand side, we're looking at a map that simply shows the areas that in Syria they call informal housing. Informal housing is a term that usually relates to the areas of the urban poor. And in the case of Homs, these were most of the people that were anti-government forces who did the bombing. Now, I would like to say that there is an uncanny resemblance between the black on the left-hand map and this and the right-hand map. We're seeing that bombing took place in these informal areas, and that the damage was the worst, was worse there. And so that I think that we can start to build a case from looking at Homs and other places that have been subject to this kind of destruction, that there may be a desire in certain quarters for ethnic change. That leads to destruction. From the destruction, we get ethnic cleansing, and then we get reconstruction, and that is actually all one process. Now, my next point on Reconstruction economics, and this is really a dreadful slide. I mean, I look at it in horror every time I see it, and I've looked at it a lot. Because what we're seeing is a proposal to redevelop Homs after the war. And you can see the proposal is completely out of scale and really has nothing to do with the existing city. It's housing and office space generally for the middle classes and the wealthy. And also, I think I would like to say that this sort of construction that has underground parking and a limited number of entrances where security forces govern who comes and who goes gives a very particular sort of security to the city that the older city, of course, didn't have, and allows anyone who is building the new development to control the city in very particular ways. We know that there's economic gains that come out of something like this, that certainly if you are a developer, it's much easier to bulldoze and rebuild than it is to simply try and restore old fragments of the city. You make your money much faster if you bulldoze and rebuild. And so that the reconstruction may be manipulated in ways that follow the demographic divisions, and it can be manipulated in a way that's very favorable to the victorious powers and their developers. And so again, I have a little sort of equation here that from the process of destruction, we get to ethnic consolidation, based on only certain groups, and that the reconstruction reflects new values of the victorious forces. And I think the one thing to add to this, too, is that the original residents then may find it difficult or impossible to return to their homes. So this opens up a whole new form of economics. Now, I think what I've been talking about so far has mostly been pretty grim. I would like to bring in one point here that gives us some sense of where we might go that is going to be a little bit more optimistic. And that has to do with public space. Now, I think, first of all, I'd say that when conflicts develop, usually the first thing that goes in a city is public space. Public space is simply too hard to control and make secure in times of conflict, so it goes very quickly. But what we've also found in our research is that public space needs to be recovered because it's through public space that people begin to mix again, even in very, very tiny ways. But that this is probably the most important thing that can happen in a city after severe conflict. And that's because the public places can be common to all. Identities can't. Identities are quite specific. But the places, even if they're understood differently by different groups, they can be common to all. Now, it raises questions, and can people maintain their identities in public places, and how can one participate in these public places? What can we learn from the spontaneity of when people, when the citizens of the city themselves start to develop public places? My lower slide there shows a spot right near the Bethlehem checkpoint in the separation barrier in Palestine. And you can see, because this is an area, however awful it is, but it's an area where people congregate. And so they're starting to sell things, and taxis come and look for fares, and so on. And we see the beginning of a spontaneous public space. If we look at the slide on top, now this is the other end of the spectrum. This is a very carefully planned and constructed public space. This is in Belfast. And it's a large glass dome right in the downtown area above the Victoria Mall. And it gives a 360-degree view of the whole city. And it was built after the Good Friday agreements. When I interviewed people there and also just listened to their conversations, some of the feedback I got was fascinating, because people said to me things like, seeing the whole city from this point makes me see it differently. So for the first time, they were actually able to see their whole city as one city and not as a divided city. Others simply said, the view belongs to all of us. This is something that they can hold in common, and that was important for them. And finally, my last point, and I don't have a nice photograph to illustrate it, but I think it's a very important one, and that is simply that there are no quick fixes These are long-term situations, and they are very, very complex. And so the idea that there can be a simple peace solution and we move on from there, the way the Marquess de Pombal did in Lisbon, is probably not going to happen anymore. That certainly what I've been talking about has to do with different periods of time in long and very, very uneven sorts of conflicts. And it also raises questions about things like heritage legislation, which are normally oriented to something that will happen relatively quickly. And that's just not going to happen. So, all right, I'm leaving you in probably with more questions than answers, but that's how we're at this point. But I think I can make a few conclusions that begin to be useful here. That heritage and construction are part of war, and they're often used as weapons in the war. They are not symptoms, they're not something that just comes after the war, and they're certainly not incidental phenomena. It is really all one process. The second point is that often undesirable practices may be made to look as if they are desirable, but we have to be able to recognize certain things as being very, very difficult, and particularly to do with the economics of Reconstruction, that is not always the best course to take in the way it's being practiced in many cities today. I think that there are contradictions in all of the heritage practices and conservation, and they have to somehow be accommodated, but we're not going to have reconciliation. The differences are too extreme, and we have to learn to live with the contradictions and make them actually work for us in a more constructive way, rather than searching for reconciliation that may just never happen. And finally, the point that context is absolutely critical, that the heritage sites and conflict conditions and ultimately whatever reconstruction that we do have are really part of wider conditions, and that public space may provide a positive direction for this. It certainly gives us some indicators, but I think in all of the different areas, we need to be looking at the wider context. And when I say context, I don't mean just simply the physical context of the place. What I'm talking about is the general societal context. So what is happening politically, what is happening culturally, and what is happening in terms of our social conditions. And all of that feeds into these really sticky problems, and we have to consider all of them. So I'm going to stop there right now. Thank you. And I would like to take some questions, please. And I see them here on the computer in front of me. Okay, I think I'll start actually with the first one. There is a very interesting one here sent to us by Garth. And he's saying conflicts are tremendously damaging to mankind, but also to the whole environment. What are your thoughts on this? And yes, my first reaction is simply, yes, I couldn't agree more. I'm actually right in the middle of writing a paper on how natural disasters, which of course include environmental disasters, are very, very much related to human destruction. And we need to join up our thinking. Like with everything else at this point, we tend to silo the thinking far too much. This idea of context that I was talking about, I think, is very, very important. But you know, what we've seen in places, I mean, if you take, for example, the Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans about 15 years ago. And the hurricane itself was probably not so bad, but then there was very, very extensive flooding that nobody really expected. After the flooding, many, many people were displaced. Many people didn't even have proper food to eat, and we get a lot of civil unrest. And the conflicts that ended up having impacts on the destruction of the city. And today there are areas of the city, particularly the black areas, the area known as the 9th Ward, which is still not being reconstructed because it's become such a complicated problem. So, Garth, yes, absolutely. I mean, there is no question that the environment as a whole is implicated in this, and we need to be paying attention to that. Okay, there's a few questions here from Garth, and I think I'll come back to them if we have time, but there's some others. Okay, an anonymous attendee. Why not consider local civil discord equal to lack of tolerance and self-actualization and selfish assertions? The delivery is mainly outcomes, not resolution of issues, but entrenchment. Ethnic splintering is likely in most global locations. Government, national or locally, are not able to bring about resolution. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think really governments could be doing more than they are at this point. I think very, very often governments don't want to touch these conflicts, or as we have in certain cases where many of the conflicts are actually instigated and made worse by government action. I mean, you know, Syria is really one of the really very, very difficult situations. But yeah, in a lot of cases, they're not able to bring about resolution. But there's no question that this has to come from a kind of a ground-up, grassroots sort of action as well. One of the things that we've found in the research that we've done in a lot of cities in the Middle East and in Europe has been that certain areas where we see some improvement actually comes from very, very strange places. And that one of the things that's extremely important to realize is that people may say one thing, but what you really need to be looking at is what they do. That very, very often people who have been living with conflict or war for a long time will immediately say, oh, you know, I turn my back on the other side. But when you actually look at how they go about their lives, very often it opens up some possibilities. Not for resolution. Resolution is so final and so difficult, and I don't think we get to resolution very easily, particularly with these conflicts that are generated by periods of violence and then some peacefulness and so on. This idea of the long-term conflict doesn't really lead us to resolution. But one of the things that we are able to find is that people find ways of moving ahead with their lives, of getting on with difference, of accepting difference for simply being different, and that not everything can be resolved or even should be resolved. That conflict, in its best forms, I would say, actually can be a very, very creative part of society. And if we look at the history of European society, for example, what we find is that conflict has generated some of our most important institutions, like Parliament, like the whole judicial court system. Well, these are adversarial conditions. These are adversarial institutions. And people don't expect to come out agreeing completely about it. They keep their disagreements, but they find ways of using the conflicts constructively, and they move on from there. So yes, there's many, many different ways of dealing with conflict, and it doesn't all come from government initiatives or government decrees. Now, yeah, another anonymous attendee here has asked about the never-ending repeating civil strife as in Beirut. No solution to perpetuating the conflict, and it depends on how the dispossessed are treated. Yes, I would certainly say that it does very, very much depend on the dispossessed. There is no respect of public space in divided areas. Well, I mean, the nature of a divided area very often is that there's been terrible degradation of the public space, and so that people are not able to live in public spaces and make use of the public spaces in ways that are positive at all. I mean, we find that in cities that have much less conflict than Beirut. And I mean, certainly there are parts of Cambridge, there are parts of London, and so on. You can see where the public spaces are not being respected in any sort of way that represents a society working together, and it's very much to do with different sorts of divisions. Now, going on, sorry, this is the same question. What we can learn is represented in many locations in the Middle East. There is no construction, there is, I think they mean a constructive solution to intra-civil conflicts. Well, yeah, I mean, as I say, the conflicts tend to go on and on. The Middle East is particularly problematic, and what we're looking at today is a Middle East that is becoming more subject to different sorts of conflicts rather than less. And certainly Beirut is one of the very, very disappointing cities at this point, because it was very much a city where different people were able to live together and work together with all sorts of tensions, but it does seem to be slipping away. But you know, I think that to say that there's no constructive solution, I think that perhaps it's more important to look at the constructive side of that phrase rather than the solution side. What are some of the things that can be constructive within a society that you don't solve the conflict? I mean, again, it's a matter of trying to find ways that people can live with each other and have rather severe degrees of disagreement, and yet at the same time not kill each other and find some sort of advantages in having a culture that is not monolithic. And this is why, you know, some of the rhetoric that we're getting today and our obsession about identity politics, I think, is rather problematic, because there is very, very much the desire to compartmentalize society rather than finding ways of bringing people together. Public space is one of the ways, probably the major way in cities that people can come together. And as I say, it can be starting with very, very tiny little moves. That if we go back to the Middle East, the question of just being able to go into this very diverse society in a public place and see a face that doesn't look like your face, or maybe hear a dialect that's different than your dialect. That these are tiny little things, and this is why I say there's no quick fixes here, but that it actually starts to make a difference, I think, to be able to get some sense of that diversity, and that maybe there will be advantages in that. Yeah, there's a question here by Robert. about water stress, and I think that's a very, very important one at this point. Should cross-border international action be taken to prevent water stress as a trigger to future ethnic cleansing? Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the questions of generally about the environment, but water, certainly in places like the Middle East, but in many, many parts of the world, can, at this point, trigger terrible conflict. There's been a certain amount of work on Syria, looking at what role the lack of water and resulting famines may have played in the war situation in Syria. Now, some of the authors that I've been looking at say that we can never attribute conflict and war to one factor, and it would be wrong to simply say the battle was all about water. Usually when we look at one particular problem, like a shortage of water, what we find is that the situation goes back long before the water shortage, and that there were already fractures in the society, and we have to understand that better. But certainly the idea that water shortage can be a trigger to a conflict is a very, very important one. And as we move into more problematic areas, certainly of climate change and all of the related factors to climate change, I think this is where we really need to try and think ahead and realize that if there is a problem like a water shortage or too much water, a flood, whatever, that may lead to a conflict that will actually be much more difficult to solve than the water shortage, the water problem in the first place. Now, there's another question by Garth. How is it possible to reduce xenophobia? Sometimes long-term harmonious coexistence eventually decays into conflict. Yeah, I mean, that is true. And we don't always expect it. The former Yugoslavia is one of the cases where this happened, where long-term neighbors from different ethnicities who were actually quite close and got on very well and had respect for each other, all of a sudden joined different sides in the conflict and started killing each other. So yes, this does happen, and it's very, very difficult to understand why and exactly when that might happen. And I mean, the questions of how we reduce xenophobia, I mean, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a sociologist, and so I think that there are limits on what I can really say about the nature of xenophobia as it relates to people. But I think, on the other hand, we come back to the work that has been done by sociologists that show that when different groups are separated from each other under stressful conditions. So if you build a wall in the middle of the city and you separate the two groups, what it tends to do to them is that it makes them fearful of the other side, that they see themselves as being, this is my part of the city with my people, and that we are somehow better than those terrible people on the other side of the wall. And that sense of vilification of the other side through actual division actually creates more conflict rather than people coming together and perhaps clashing some of the time, but at least having some knowledge of the other side. And as I say, there's been a fair amount of sociological work done on that gives us some indicators about the importance of bringing people together. And so that, for my work, then, is obviously very, very important, because then I can move on it in terms of what does that look like in physical form, how does that affect cities. Now, I think I'm being told that we're at the end of our time, and so I'm going to have to stop here. I really enjoyed your questions, and I've enjoyed talking to you, and thank you very much.